The movie is set in Washington, D.C., where people of all age groups appear to be living together in peace. In this busy city, almost everyone is engrossed in their life and is just trying to have a good time. Amongst them is a young, ambitious man named Isaiah, who happens to be a struggling artist. One day, whilst observing different portraits in an art exhibition, Isaiah ends up meeting Stevie, a charismatic and incredibly intelligent woman. The two admire a painting together and talk about how art is so intense and introspective. They continue to chat for a while and eventually get close. Shortly after, Isaiah walks over to his friend Yusef, who just so happens to be the artist behind all of the portraits in the exhibition. After chatting for some time, Yusef introduces Isaiah to Chennai, an art curator. The two get to know more about each other and instantly start discussing art. At one point, Chennai even praises Isaiah for his talent and skills. She even goes on to say that he's pretty special and has quite a bright future. To help him, Chennai offers to put up some of his work in her next exhibition. She proposes that if the painting is good, then she might even represent him in a solo show. Upon hearing this, Isaiah gets excited and thanks Chennai for the opportunity. Now more determined than ever, Isaiah begins working hard on his paintings. He is adamant about making it big by any means possible. One night, Isaiah goes to a club and observes all the people around him. There, he meets a gorgeous woman named Mecca. The two hug one another and casually talk about sweet nothings. Just then, Mecca's boyfriend walks over and greets the two. All three of them chat amongst each other and enjoy the night. At one point, Stevie enters the club as well. It turns out that she's a close friend of Mecca and her boyfriend, Nick. As the night goes on, Stevie and Mecca dance to the music and have a lot of fun. Meanwhile, Isaiah, who had been playing snooker, notices Stevie as well and immediately approaches her. The two finally introduce themselves properly and talk about how it's such a small world. Eventually, Isaiah compliments Stevie and starts flirting with her. Both of them are quite interested in each other. Shortly after, Nick and Mecca join the two with some drinks. All of them hang out together and have loads of fun. They drink the night away while singing and dancing. Stevie and Isaiah also dance together and make each other laugh. As a result, love blossoms between the two. The next morning, Isaiah decides to drop Stevie home. Curious, he takes this as an opportunity to get to know her better. Thus, the two walk together whilst learning more about each other. After finding out about Isaiah's profession, Stevie jokes about how she doesn't have a single artistic bone in her body. In response, Isaiah simply laughs and asserts that every person in the world is artistic in their unique way. He even goes on to say that black people create stuff out of nothing every day, which can very well be deemed as art. A couple moments later, Isaiah asks Stevie about her profession, and that's when the latter says that she's a law student. She even goes on to explain that she's named after Stevie Wonder. Furthermore, she continues and says that she lived in Rotterdam until she was 16, even though her entire family is originally from DC. Eventually, Stevie ends up reaching her place and thanks Isaiah for dropping her off. The two hug each other one last time before finally parting ways. However, just before leaving, Isaiah musters up all the courage he has and asks Stevie out on a date. Thankfully, the latter agrees and even hands him her number. The two then kiss each other and walk away. The scene now shifts to Isaiah and his family returning home after church. The four of them chat for quite a while until Isaiah's father, Mr. Maxwell, asks him about his career path. Concerned, he urges his son to secure a stable job so that he can have a better future. However, Isaiah blatantly refuses the offer and asserts that he's focusing on his art. That's when his sister, whose name is Claudette, starts making fun of him for just loitering around. Even Isaiah's mother, Mrs. Maxwell, chimes in at that moment and encourages him to take up a well-paying offer. That way, he would finally be able to afford a nice apartment. Isaiah tries to refuse, but he's immediately interrupted by his father, who mocks him for being so careless. Furious, he berates Isaiah for relying on just his art and nothing else. Now incredibly annoyed, Isaiah tries to defend himself, but Mr. Maxwell doesn't let him do so. Instead, the latter taunts him for not having a real job. As if this wasn't enough, he continues and yells at Isaiah for not starting a family. Unable to control his emotions anymore, Isaiah storms out of the place and tries to calm himself down. Meanwhile, Stevie, who appears to be in a cafe with Mecca, continues thinking about Isaiah. However, she soon brushes that thought aside and continues talking to Mecca about her career. Frustrated, she vents about how her parents want her to work at a big law firm so that she can establish herself in the field. Sadly, she doesn't want to do so. Upon hearing this, Mecca simply assures her by saying that she should just do what her heart desires. Eventually, Mecca brings up Isaiah and teases Stevie about it. In response, the latter just blushes and claims that she doesn't have time for a relationship at the moment. However, after some time, Stevie shyly confesses to Mecca about how Isaiah asked her out on a date. Hearing this, the latter just giggles and wishes her all the best. The scene now shifts back to Isaiah, who appears to be hanging out with Yusef. They talk about their art for some time, until Yusef finally asks Isaiah about his ongoing painting. In response, the latter replies that he is still stuck with the portrait and doesn't know how to continue. That's when Yusef asks him to get some inspiration that would help him continue. Hearing this, Isaiah asks Yusef about his inspiration sources, to which he replies that to get inspired, you need to go out in the world. Yusef then goes on to explain that one can't just sit idly and wait for their muse to arrive. They have to go and find it. Furthermore, he asks Isaiah to separate his studio from his living space. Now motivated, the latter agrees to all the suggestions and decides to start working on his paintings again. On the other hand, Stevie continues fighting for the welfare of the Black and Latino community in DC. She protests against the flawed housing system in the state, which in turn harms the desperate, poor families there. Later that day, Isaiah and Stevie go on a date together and have loads of fun. They organize a small picnic at a nearby park and talk about their lives. Eventually, Isaiah takes Stevie back to his apartment and shows her all of his paintings. At one point, Stevie uncovers a massive portrait that Isaiah seems to be working on. As soon as removes the cover, she is stunned by the incredible art. Impressed, she tells him that work is magnificent. In response, Isaiah just smiles and thanks her for her kind words. After talking for quite some time, the two begin to get closer and closer. Isaiah slowly walks up to Stevie and looks at her with intense passion. Needless to say, the two make out and caress each other's bodies. The very next morning, Isaiah gets inspiration for his art and immediately begins working on his painting. He works hard and finally ends up creating a masterpiece. After completing the painting, he sends it to Stevie, who is left in utter shock at the beauty of the portrait. Now more confused than ever, Stevie instantly calls Isaiah and asks him about the painting. In response, the latter just smiles and confesses that he sent it to her as a gift. Moving forward, Stevie completely falls in love with Isaiah after seeing just how sweet he is. Wanting to take this relationship to the next step, she invites him over to her house. There, the two consider several places to hang the gorgeous painting. They flirt with one another and eventually decide to hang the painting in Stevie's bedroom. Both of them admire the beauty of the portrait for quite a while. As time goes on, Stevie and Isaiah get closer than ever before. They spend almost every moment together and have loads of fun. The two even go shopping and click multiple lovely pictures together. All in all, their relationship appears to be just perfect. They hang out a lot and understand each other completely. One day, the two lovebirds meet up with Nick and Mecca for a double date. There, all four of them chat with each other. At one point, Nick even teases Isaiah for being head over heels for Stevie. He jokes about how the latter has never been so crazy in love before. Hearing this, Stevie just blushes and tries to change the topic. Later that day, Isaiah goes back to his parents' house and helps his father with several errands. He assists Mr. Maxwell in painting the living room and even tries to make small talk with the latter. However, even after trying his hardest, Mr. Maxwell continues to mock him for his passion. He taunts Isaiah for not even trying to get a real job. At that moment, Isaiah informs his father that he's getting representation soon, which in turn means that his work will finally be on sale. Upon hearing this, Mr. Maxwell just grimaces and goes back to his chores. He's not happy about his son's career choice. Eventually, after a couple of days, Isaiah gets an opportunity to present his art in a gallery. As expected, his art gets a lot of attention. Almost everyone present at the gallery praises him for his skills and talent. Seeing this, Stevie gleefully congratulates Isaiah and tells him just how proud she is. Shortly after, Nick and Mecca arrive at the scene as well. They carefully observe Isaiah's art and praise him for the masterpiece. Thoroughly impressed, Nick even tells Isaiah that he will become famous. In response, the latter just smiles and thanks his friends for all the sweet comments. Just as Stevie and Isaiah are observing all the portraits at the gallery, they run into Adam. It turns out that Isaiah and Adam went to college together. Eventually, both of them decided to pursue painting. When Stevie learns all this, she asks Adam if he's also presenting his art at the gallery. That's when the latter replies that he's just here to observe all the paintings. He then starts to boast about how he just landed a solo show at a very big gallery. Adam further goes on to say that he spent several months in Rome just to get his art ready. Upon hearing this, Isaiah gets visibly upset. However, he stays calm and simply congratulates Adam for his success. Shortly after, Isaiah walks over to Chennai, who proceeds to tell him that his painting is wonderful. However, she then tells him that he could do a lot better. Thankfully, Isaiah takes this constructive criticism and vows to become much better. Later that night, Stevie and Isaiah go back to her apartment where the two talk for quite some time. As the movie progresses, Isaiah slowly undresses Stevie and wraps himself in her arms. Needless to say, the two spend the night together and take their relationship to a whole new level. The very next morning, Isaiah sadly tells Stevie that his solo show has been postponed. He goes on to explain that Chennai is still unsure about his talent. It turns out the latter doesn't think that Isaiah has figured out his inspirations yet. Because of this, she offered him some more time to get things right. Upon hearing this, Stevie gets concerned and asks Isaiah if he knows what he's going to do. In response, the latter asserts that he has a lot to say through his paintings. He just doesn't know how he's going to do so. That's when Stevie asks him to just move in with her. She continues and says that since they spend every night together, they might as well start to stay together. Initially, Isaiah is hesitant at the offer, but he soon remembers Yusef's suggestion and agrees. Later that day, Isaiah goes to meet Yusef and tells him all about his dilemma. He explains that he's having trouble getting his first solo show. Meanwhile, his college friends like Adam are already on their second and third shows in places like New York. Upon hearing this, Yusuf asks Isaiah if his art is truly better than Adam's. The latter confidently replies that it is. That's when Yusuf tells Isaiah that just being better isn't enough. He must know how to show his art to the world. His painting should speak to the audience. Isaiah finally understands this and tries even harder than before. Shortly after, Isaiah and Stevie meet up again where the latter contemplates whether getting a law degree is worth it or not. In response, Isaiah simply tells her that even if the degree somehow ends up being unnecessary, it will surely make her a lot more incredible at what she already does. Hearing this, Stevie tells Isaiah that she wants to be more like him and wishes to be bold in her opinion and work. In response, the latter counters by saying that his work isn't ever understood by people. Frustrated, he adds that he's tired of explaining his art to people. He further goes on to say that his work hasn't left a lasting impact on anyone. Upon hearing this, Stevie just sighs and tells Isaiah that he'll do better. Later that day, Stevie takes Isaiah to her parents' house. However, just before entering the place, she warns Isaiah about how strict her mother is. She then goes on to reveal that her parents know nothing about them living together. Hearing this, Isaiah assures Stevie by saying that he'll present himself in a very well-mannered way. He even promises that he won't reveal anything that her parents do not already know. Eventually, Stevie's mother, Mrs. Richmond, opens the door and cheerily greets the two. Being a very poised woman herself, she carefully observes Isaiah before finally letting him in. Once inside, Stevie runs up to her father and greets him happily. In the meantime, Isaiah timidly walks up to Mr. Richmond and introduces himself. He compliments their beautiful house and tries his best to leave a good impression. Shortly after, Isaiah and Stevie join her parents for dinner where Mrs. Richmond continues asking Isaiah all about his career. It's clear that just like Mr. Maxwell, she isn't impressed with his career choice. When Stevie notices this, she tries to intervene, but her mother doesn't even bother acknowledging her. Instead, she continues making Isaiah uncomfortable by saying that making money by selling art is a big risk. Having had enough, Stevie tries to stop Mrs. Richmond, but the latter taunts her for dating a man without a successful future. She even goes as far as to mock Stevie for working at a small law firm rather than a well-renowned one. Thankfully, Isaiah intervenes just in time and diffuses the situation by talking about how hard-working and talented Stevie is. As the night goes on, Mrs. Richmond asks Stevie about her love life with Isaiah. Just when the latter thought that her mother was done, Mrs. Richmond taunts her again for wasting her time on a man like Isaiah. Now enraged, Stevie confesses to her parents that she and Isaiah are living together. When Mr. and Mrs. Richmond hear this, they're incredibly disappointed. They become furious at the fact that Isaiah doesn't have a place of his own and is living in Stevie's home instead. This gives them all the more reason to dislike Isaiah. Finally, after a very awkward dinner, Stevie and Isaiah drive back home. Both of them are shaken up by the meeting. Isaiah begins to feel inferior because almost everything is paid for by Stevie. Since his art hasn't taken off, he mostly relies on her. So, after the remarks from Stevie's parents, this starts to affect him deeply. One day, whilst the two are out for dinner with Mecca and Nick, Isaiah starts to act cold. When Mecca proposes that they all go fishing on the weekend, he instantly declines the offer and says that he has to work on his painting. This makes Stevie confused as Isaiah had been working on his art all week. She tries to convince him to just take one day off, but the latter immediately refuses. Because of this, Stevie becomes furious. She notices Isaiah's behavior and calls him out for it. However, this just causes a fight to break out between the two. Soon, a couple days by, but Isaiah's behavior still doesn't change. This starts to worry Stevie, so she vents about this to her friends. Concerned, she talks about how Isaiah is so stressed all the time. That's when her friend, Cicely, explains that since he's a man, depending on his girlfriend is shameful for him. Cicely further goes on to say that Isaiah probably wants to take care of her, and not of it the other way around. After hearing this, Stevie finally understands Isaiah's dilemma and decides to just wait for the latter to come to her. On the other hand, Isaiah continues working hard on his painting. He spends day and night just working on his art. Eventually, after a lot of hard work, his work is finally finished. As soon as the painting is completed, Isaiah calls Chennai over to review it. Thankfully, the latter loves the art and immediately books him for a solo show. Needless to say, Isaiah is elated by the news. At dinner, he informs Stevie about his show, who happily congratulates him. Excited, she tells him just how proud she is of him. Now that things are finally going according to plan, Isaiah starts to loosen up. He goes back to being happy and cheery again. When Stevie notices this, she is extremely relieved. At night, she dances with Isaiah and kisses him passionately. Things get heated very quickly and the two end up making love. The next day, while Stevie is working, she gets a call stating that she has been accepted into multiple high-ranking law firms in the country. After working in various firms and doing everything she possibly can, she finally gets her breakthrough. However, she doesn't seem too happy to be getting such an opportunity. Since she's madly in love with Isaiah, she doesn't want to move away from him. That night, Stevie waits for Isaiah outside a dance theater. She waits for him for quite a while, but the latter doesn't show up. Now desperate, she calls him and even texts him multiple times. Sadly, Isaiah is so engrossed in his work that he completely forgets about going out with Stevie. He continues working on his painting without a care in the world. Eventually, Stevie gets tired of waiting and just walks inside the theater. There, she meets up with her parents who smirk at Isaiah's absence. The two look at her with pity, as though to show her that Isaiah is not worth the effort. After the show, Stevie goes back home and quietly makes dinner. Just then, Isaiah shows up and profusely apologizes to her for standing her up. In response, Stevie simply smiles and forgives him. She doesn't say anything and just continues doing her chores. The next morning, whilst the two are out exercising, Stevie blurts out that she's going to Chicago. She goes on to explain that she has been accepted into a very prestigious law firm. When Isaiah hears this, he gets excited and congratulates her. He then asks her how they're going to make their relationship work. In response, Stevie simply says that she'll figure something out. A couple of days later, Isaiah finally gets ready with all his paintings. His solo show begins shortly after and gains a lot of traction. Myriads of people appreciate his art. Even his parents congratulate him for his amazing paintings. Moving forward, as the show continues, Chennai introduces Isaiah to several other curators and helps him connect with them. She then praises him in front of the entire audience at the gallery, who happily cheer him on. Nick, Mecca, Yusef, and Stevie all clap for him and celebrate his success. Soon after the show, Chennai hands Isaiah a check for his paintings. When the latter takes it, he is surprised to see such a huge amount of money. His paintings did well at the show. Needless to say, he is eternally grateful and thanks Chennai for such a wonderful opportunity. On the other hand, Stevie continues thinking about whether she should go to Chicago or not. Incredibly confused, she tells her mother about her situation, who immediately asks her to take up the offer. Furthermore, Mrs. Richmond goes on to tell her that she should never put anyone else before her career. Stevie initially agrees with her mother but then decides to ask Isaiah about it as well. She musters up all the courage she had and asks his opinion on the topic. To her surprise, Isaiah tells her to go to Chicago and pursue her dreams. He encourages her to follow her dreams and make the most of the opportunity. But instead of being happy, Stevie is disappointed. She had fully assumed that he would stop her, but sadly, he didn't do so. Instead, he asked her to take up the job. Later that night, Stevie acts cold toward Isaiah. She doesn't speak to him and just continues thinking about their previous conversation. When Isaiah finally asks her about it, she blows up on him and accuses him of never being there for her. Enraged, she tells him that he's always caught up with work and never makes time for her. In response, Isaiah asserts that he has been working on getting a solo show for years. He further goes on to say this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for him. Soon enough, things get escalated and the two get into a massive fight. In the end, Isaiah taunts Stevie for being rich and always having someone to rely on. Upon hearing this, the latter realizes that her mother was right all along. Now furious, Stevie tells Isaiah that she has already accepted the job in Chicago. Needless to say, Isaiah is deeply hurt by this. Enraged, he yells at her for not even telling him before. The fight goes on for quite a while until Stevie realizes that she's had enough. Now incredibly frustrated, she asks Isaiah to get out of her house. The latter does exactly as told and immediately walks out. The next morning, Stevie wakes up and begins remembering all the events from the night before. Meanwhile, Isaiah continues working on his paintings with Chennai by his side. After getting off the phone, the latter gleefully informs him that his paintings are doing great. She even goes on to tell him that if he somehow manages to increase his output, then he can present his paintings in galleries all around the world. Upon hearing this, Isaiah realizes just how close he is to his dream. He also finds the inspiration for his art and immediately starts working on it. Whilst painting, Isaiah reminisces about all the moments he spent with Stevie. Tears well up in his eyes, but he continues working hard to achieve his dreams. Soon, a year passes by and Isaiah appears to have finally made it. He is now a very famous and influential painter. One day, Nick comes to visit him and the two catch up with one another. After talking for quite a while, Nick invites him over to hang out on the weekend. However, Isaiah politely declines the offer and says that he has to go to Chicago for his next show. Thankfully, Nick understands the situation and just continues observing all of Isaiah's paintings. At one point, he asks the latter if he ever spoke to Stevie after the incident. In response, Isaiah simply replies that he hasn't. A couple of days later, Isaiah travels to Chicago for his art show. As expected, his paintings are appreciated by loads of people. Surprisingly, Stevie also shows up at the art gallery with her boyfriend, Ahmed. Just as the two are observing all the paintings there, they run into Isaiah. An awkward tension settles in the air for quite some time. However, Stevie quickly regains her composure and greets Isaiah happily. The latter does the same and soon, the two start talking. They chat for a very short time and eventually part ways. Later that day, Stevie goes back home and stares at the painting that Isaiah had given to her. Meanwhile, Isaiah also can't stop thinking about Stevie. After almost a year of not talking to each other, he sends her a voicemail inviting her to his next show in DC. He also asks her to meet him and thankfully, the latter agrees. That very night, the two meet at a nearby bar and greet each other cheerily. They're both awkward at first, but soon, they get comfortable and start talking about their lives. Eventually, Stevie congratulates Isaiah for his success and tells him that his work is amazing. In response, the latter just smiles. He then asks her if she has any plans for tonight, to which Stevie replies that she doesn't. Soon, one thing leads to another and the two end up making love. They spend the entire night together and get lost in each other's arms. Overwhelmed with emotions, Stevie finally confesses to Isaiah that she misses him a lot. Hearing this, Isaiah also musters up all the courage he has and admits that he's in love with her. The next morning, Stevie and Isaiah wake up and kiss each other passionately. They talk about sweet nothings and for a moment, everything seems to have gone back to how it initially was. However, that's when Isaiah gets a call. As usual, he immediately answers and starts talking about work. This makes Stevie realize that he still hasn't changed one bit. She finally comes to terms with the fact that she'll never be his priority. Shortly after, Stevie gets dressed and proceeds to leave. Seeing this, Isaiah tries to stop her, but the latter doesn't listen. Desperate, he tells her that he'll complete his sketches fast so that they can spend time together. Sadly, Stevie ignores this and just walks away. Now enraged, Isaiah asks her if she still has feelings for him, to which she timidly replies that she does. He then begs her to stay, but Stevie just kisses him one last time before finally walking out the door. After a couple of days, Stevie goes back to DC and meets up with her mother, who kindly tells her that if the person she's in love with isn't ready for her, then the relationship isn't going to work out. She consoles Stevie for quite some time, which finally helps the latter feel a little better. Eventually, the day of Isaiah's show arrives and all his loved ones attend the exhibit. Even Stevie shows up and meets up with all her friends. She then begins observing all the paintings around her. At one point, she notices an extraordinary portrait of a woman. Curious, she gets closer and realizes that the woman in the painting is none other than her. It turns out that Isaiah's biggest inspiration to continue painting and reach such great heights was her. The movie finally ends with Isaiah standing right behind Stevie, who continues looking at the painting with awe and pain.